Bros, who will introduce our speaker.
Good morning. I'm Barbara Bros, a member of the Kalamazoo Art League. As many of you know, Art League is a volunteer organization founded in 1955 to organize annual lecture series at the Kalamazoo Institute of Arts. Our mission: to present programs featuring experts who create, curate, study, or write about visual art, is fulfilled when we are enlightened. So, welcome, members, guests, and future video viewers of today's illustrated talk with Dr. Nir Shafir. Though coming to us today from Italy, Dr. Shafir is assistant professor, tenure track, in the Department of History, University of California, San Diego. He studies the history of the Ottoman Empire, 1200 to 1850, specifically how material culture has shaped the intellectual, science, and religious life of the Ottoman Empire and the larger Middle East. And we all know that that shaping is highly relevant as well as interesting. Today, Professor Shafir is going to speak to us about painted forgeries and forging Islamic science. I am so pleased to introduce Nir Shafir. Nir?
Thank you, Barbara, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you, everyone, for coming here today. I very much want to extend my appreciation for this invitation. And today I'm going to be speaking about essentially a topic that I started writing about a few years ago. That became actually a relatively popular article once I published it online, at least relatively popular in terms of academic stuff. And I'm going to start off, as I do with my classes, and actually have on this topic a small quiz. And I can't have you respond to me like the students do. So I think maybe if you want to respond, if you want to guess in this quiz, you can write your answers in the chat and I'll try to monitor them. But I'm going to show you 5 images. 4 of them are forgeries. If you've read my article, you might be able to identify some of them, but 4 of them are going to be forgeries. So what I want to know, which one is the authentic historical illustration? So let me start off by showing you these images, and I've numbered them so you can kind of identify them. Number 1 is 3 men looking up at the night sky, 2 through what looks like telescopes. On the bottom right here is a man apparently going around using a globe of some sort and writing in this book. Number 2 here is you see men essentially using also different sorts of its instruments. In the bottom here, you also have a globe and the map of the earth shown. Remember, one of these is going to be real, but 4 of them are fake. Here you have what looks like to be a sick man approaching a sort of doctor, asking for medical advice. Here we have some sort of circumcision or genital surgery being performed on a boy. And the 5th is an example of a circulatory system, an image, a representation of what the circulatory system, at least the veins and the arteries, would have looked like in the past. So what I want to basically know is, you can guess, you can participate or not, keeping in mind which one of these are real. Here are the images again. And if you want to type in the chat, I'll look at it for a second. But this is number 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, from left to right. Okay, so we have 1 vote for number 1. One for number 2, another 1, number 3. Barbara says number 5. Number 3, number 4. So, 5. Let me actually, okay. So we get a sense. I mean, one point we can just see from this quiz, one is that at least for most people, I think for the average person, it's quite hard to tell which of this is actually legitimate or not. And actually, let me tell you which one it is. It's actually this one, number 2. I realized there was like, it's this image of men using different instruments. Some people pointed out that, it's the telescopes here that might be the one that are real. Other people pointed out to number 5 as the real one. This number 5 is actually based off of a real image, but it's a forgery and it's covered in sort of gibberish Arabic on the right here. This one is also kind of based off, to some degree, based off of a real image, but again, created to resemble one. This one is a complete fabrication. It's never existed as any sort of real historical image. This one is actually quite, I'll get into the history of it a bit, but this is it was meant to depict an observatory in Istanbul in 1596, sponsored by the Sultan at the time, Murad III. And the one on the left is another common one. You can actually see it. I'll show you pieces of this one reproduced, transposed onto this first image here that is people using the telescope. So what I want to talk about today is basically 3 questions, which we'll get to here. One, why are these forgeries proliferating? Who's making them? What's their appeal? What exactly is going on here? And how do they enter, not just, I argue, online life, but also places like museums and scholarly conferences and so forth. And more important that, this isn't just going to be a talk about exposing forgeries necessarily, but what I want to talk about is kind of what's the line between forgery, recreation, and invention in museums. And for that, we're going to jump to another part. We're going to start talking about the history of science museums, specifically the one in Istanbul, but also mention the one in Milan, if any of you have been to, and their attempts at recreating objects kind of from scratch. And from there, I want to kind of speak about what's the harm of these forgeries and recreations, or is there any? And ultimately, what I'd like to kind of end on is some reflection about, is there a way to go beyond this question rather than saying, this is fact and this is fiction. We should prioritize real historical objects and dismiss forgeries. Maybe there's a way to find a middle path in this world. And let me just start off with this, essentially to show you where these forgeries have ended up. On one hand, they've ended up on book covers. So the one on the left, as you can see here, is actually on the cover of this book, a translation of the 14th century Mamluk scribal encyclopedia by my colleague. In this book, when I first saw it, I took for granted that this was a real illustration, but then things sort of didn't add up. And then seeing this image kind of started off my investigation. What I found out, as I explained kind of in some of my written work, is that looking at this image, there's nothing to really tell you that it's a fake actually right away. The only thing I was able to figure out, you might think that, for example, telescopes are not commonly referred to, but there are references in some literature about telescopes in the Middle East. They were adopted relatively quickly after first being invented in Europe in the mid-17th century. So telescopes could be a giveaway, but they weren't clear enough. Also, the globe might be something that might be suspicious, but as you saw, if you remember the picture number 2, there was also a globe in it. What ended up showing me that this was a forgery was the fact that this person is using a quill pen. And if you look at, if you know kind of historical Middle Eastern culture, people didn't use quill pens like they did in Europe to write books. They always used reeds. And so this is a sort of imagination of the forger or the illustrator projecting it onto the period. So these images essentially end up in many other places. So this one of the sick man, looks like a man with smallpox or something, ended up in a conference photo, but also in a kind of quasi, not academic, but kind of fancy magazine called Aramco World, which does a lot of stuff in Middle Eastern history. And they reproduce a lot of these other fakes. But they also end up in archives and libraries because as forgers are trying to sell this material, they talk to dealers, and the dealers kind of present their wares to various libraries. This one, for example, ended up in a collection of the Whipple Museum in Cambridge University. Whipple Museum is the Museum of History of Science there. And they ended up buying 10 or 12 or so of these pieces. And then because they were in the museum, they also ended up on their website and different educational stuff connected to the University of Oxford and the University of Cambridge. And they also end up occasionally in places like the digital collections of Oxford University Library. This one, if you can look, this one is actually a bit more complicated because this was donated to them as a fake, but they continued to display it as a real illustration. They've since changed this, but if you look here, they don't make it clear at all that this picture of what's supposed to be a tooth worm in a molar is essentially entirely an invention. So what I'm just trying to show you is how these images are spreading around. And now what I want to go through is kind of, well, what kind of images are there? Why are they proliferating? And why are we attracted to them? What do we find so enticing about them? So let me just quickly go through kind of some of the typologies of forgeries that we see here, right? So some of them, they basically, the one on the right is the forgery. This is the authentic one, the historical illustration. What they've done is basically made a very crude copy of what was a very nice image, right? So that whoever this forger was just wasn't able to kind of recreate the level of detail in any way. Oftentimes they kind of take pieces of real ones. So as I pointed out, this man looking at what is supposed to be a quadrant, I believe, used to measure types of angles in the celestial sky, and turn it essentially into a sort of telescope, as you can see in the two pictures on the right. Each one is, they're just kind of taking pieces, the same with the globe, right? They're taking pieces of it, sometimes it's flipping them around, giving little different details, but more or less not changing it. Obviously here you can see these two seem to be produced by the same workshop since they have very similar elements. The man sitting down under this sort of veranda type thing. Sometimes these forgeries are taking inspiration from random images in the internet. So as I showed you before, there's an image of a quite common one of a tooth worm, basically a worm that's supposed to live in people's, demon worm that's supposed to live in people's cavities or teeth and create cavities. And this one, as far as we can tell, came from an image that was circulating on the internet about 10 years ago. Supposed ivory from 18th century France. I can no longer find where it was, where it is now. But they're just looking online for kind of interesting images, and you can see they basically recreated it full scale here. Here is another version. And some of them are just invented completely from scratch, like this image of a sick person going to the pharmacist, this image of a boat, or this, again, another pharmacy type scene here. And often these, they're not all just about science. Some of them are meant to titillate, like these kind of quasi-sexual ones. Or this one, kind of just a random picture of a horse playing some sort of instrument. But they are, for the most part, about depicting science. Right? They show men at work playing with instruments, using instruments, things like this, right? So often you just have, these are, again, these are very nice forgeries. again from the Whipple Museum, very high quality ones. But what they've done is essentially created images, probably pastiches of different things, but showing kind of men doing science. And what you see here is that what they've often done, and I think I'll show this again in a second, but they've taken original documents. In this case, I don't remember what, some of these are stock certificates. Often they're mostly just leaves of old manuscripts that they've bought. In this case, they've pasted them together, as you can see on the back here. You take 4 pieces, paste them together, and then paint it over them. And often they end up incorporating these pieces or the pieces of the original script into it to make it seem more authentic, as I'll show you. So what are the origins? They're basically just tourist tchotchkes. They're, let's say, for someone who's trained as an art historian, and I don't consider myself an art historian, but having spent enough time with art historians, I kind of developed an eye for them. But they're sold for tourists, and I also, when I first saw them in the markets of Istanbul, I also fell for them. I thought, wow, look, this is amazing. Wouldn't it be nice to buy one of these? But they can be quite complicated, and they occasionally get sold by dealers to libraries and other places. And they range in price maybe between $30 to $300, depending on the complexity, how gullible the buyer is, etc. But they're quite crude. So in a sense that if you take it to anyone who has actual knowledge of this material, I think they'll immediately be able to tell you that they're not real. And it's not just in Istanbul. Istanbul is where you can, I think, where it started, where you can find it. But nowadays you can find this anywhere that has kind of old manuscripts running about. Places like I've seen them in Bukhara and Uzbekistan. You can find them in India and Delhi, and I'm sure all over in Pakistan and Iran as well. And as I said, they basically take old manuscripts, sometimes pieces of them, sometimes they tear them apart, and then incorporate the writings into this. So that what they do is essentially, this is genuine writing, which has nothing to do with the image. They paint it over, and then to kind of make it seem more authentic, they also add some writing over the image to kind of make it seem like someone commented it on, something like that. Here, what's interesting is that even though, as I said, this is an authentic image to somewhat degree, an authentic, based on an historical exemplar of the circulatory system, if you were to try to read this, it would be gibberish. It has letters that don't exist in the Arabic alphabet. But of course, for most people, it just seems to be liable. Here you can see, for example, what they've done, and this is a sort of religious poem. They painted over it, but they've left a bit of it up on top just to make it seem authentic. And here on the bottom, you can see they even put a fake seal to make it seem like someone, stamped their possession on it or something like that. So how do these get from the tourist markets of Istanbul or the tourist markets elsewhere to, let's say, to be used on the cover of books? Well, the in-between merchant is essentially stock photo agencies. And we can see this, you probably know stock photo agencies. They're where you have to buy any sort of image that you want to use on a book cover or online. And they essentially started off from this one photographer, as far as I can tell, this man named Gianni Daleorti, who doesn't seem to be a real person, but in any case, he, or whoever it is, kind of attributed these images, photographed them about 10 years ago, attributed them to a library in Istanbul. Of course, when I went to that library, they had no record or any image, any version of those. And then they put them online. And so these stock photo websites basically make money from selling the rights to these reproductions. And of course, they copy from one another, or they kind of sub-license or something like that. And so you can find the same image across multiple different sites. So even if you manage to take it down from one of them, kind of crop up in others. Here, for example, even is this one welcome image. Welcome Trust is a trust dedicated to studies of medicine. So they're nonprofit, but they also have a lot of these fake miniatures on their kind of stock photo page, which you can use for minimal investment. And as always, stock photo agencies are built essentially. They appeared relatively recently. They're sort of parasites, or let's say, what emerged after the collapse of traditional photojournalism in the 2000s, when newspapers were no longer able to pay for their photographers anymore. And they essentially feed this kind of increasing need for images that we have in day-to-day life, right? So whenever I need to make a PowerPoint presentation for my lecture, as you'll see throughout this, I need to put in I need some image. And often it's just easier just to Google, to go online to search for it. And the same thing, of course, goes for any sort of magazine or any book cover. The people in charge of it go out and find whatever image sort of fits their desires or their needs. And what that means is that the kind of images they end up using become almost, in a sense, crudely illustrative, or if you just need something to show an idea in visual format as much as possible, and you need it for essentially everything nowadays. And that's how you end up things, these images all over different places. And from there, they end up in social media. They spread even further, and then they end up on further stock photo images. Right? And so each time, this kind of, what ends up happening is that each, what you might call a chain of transmission, that one of these images is sort of passed on, it sort of gains a little bit of reputability, a bit of credibility, right? It becomes a bit more believable, because obviously people wouldn't be using these things. Most of my colleagues, when I confront them about the use of these fake images, they say, well, everyone's been using these, or these have been around for so long, they have to be true, right? They wouldn't be false. And so the more they circulate, the truer they seem. And in a sense, they end up, as I'll show later, in sort of replacing our images of what historically existed. And this doesn't just happen to Middle Eastern or Islamic scientific stuff. It also happens on occasion to things, for example, from medieval Europe. So here's an image from the British Library. And what you see here is essentially people who are sick, searching, getting some sort of cure, or seeking the advice of a bishop. Originally, this was an image. This is an image of apparently people with leprosy, or sinners who have been smote with leprosy and are trying to say be cured for their sins and for their illnesses. But what ended up happening is that essentially false. When the British Library was putting this up online, they created when they described it, they said this is actually an image of plague. And then from that misattribution, fake description, it kind of spread further and further around. And now today, if you look online, you see this image, it's mostly described as an image of plague. Of course, this is at the very least a real historical image. It's not like the images that I've shown you in this so-called Islamic context, in which all of these things are, let's say, the images I've shown you are invented. So what's driving our desire for these images, besides, of course, the general interest, the beauty of these images? I think there's also, as I'll come back to, there's a strong desire, I think, at least in articles, in museums, and other places, to show that Muslims partook in science, right? That in science today is really seen as often as it's still today, as a marker of rationality. And by that sense, belonging to our political community. And as Islamophobia becomes stronger and stronger and more clear in our society today, especially in the past 10 to 15 years, there's an increasing need in a sense to try to defend Muslims by showing that they also participated in what we consider kind of our universal rational project, which is science. And so there's a desire often to highlight these objects and images from museums and other places. So before I get into the second part of my presentation, I do just want to kind of speak briefly about what did actual scientific illustrations look like in the past. If we were to look at manuscripts from the pre-modern period, before 1800, before when everything was actually still a manuscript, that is, everything, mostly in the Islamic world, everything was copied by hand. How many images and what kind of images would there be depicting science? And the reality is that most